Place value of decimals. In the last video, we looked at the value of digits that are less than a whole. These are called decimals. Whole numbers are those that come before the decimal point, so here we can see we've got units, tens, hundreds and bigger. And then the numbers that come after the decimal points, here we've got tenths and hundredths, they're part of a whole. Let's look at the number 32.46. The number that comes before the decimal point, we know that this is our unit, and the 3, that's worth 3 tens. Then the numbers after the decimal point, so we have the decimal point, the 4, this is 4 tenths. Now sometimes you will see it written as a fraction like that, 1/10, and sometimes you will see a small t. So we know that this 4 here is worth 4 tenths. And then the 6 is worth 6 hundredths. Sometimes you'll see that written as hundredths, and sometimes you'll just see a small lowercase h. So we have the number 32.46. That means 32 whole ones, 4 tenths, and 6 hundredths. Let's look at some more decimals. So here we have 4.76, 26.51, and notice how after the decimal point I'm saying each individual digit. I'm not saying 26.51, I'm saying 26.51. That's to show the difference between the tenths and the hundredths. And then here I have 0.23 and 128.49. When you first start working with decimals, it can be tricky to think about which decimal is larger or which decimal is smaller. It's really useful to think about money, so which is the most amount of money? So if we put a pound sign in front of these decimals, which would be the smallest? So if we were thinking about these amounts as money, we'd look at the numbers before the decimal point first to work out which one's larger. So I can see here that £128.49 or 128.49 is going to be the largest. I can also see that this amount here is going to be the smallest because there's no pounds. So I've got 0, that means I've got no wholes. I've just got 2 tenths and 3 hundredths. Or if I was working with money, I'd have no pounds and 23 pence. Let's look at another set of decimals. So if we wanted to order these decimals, put them in order of size, first of all we're going to look at the units. Wow, we can see here that all the units, there are none, there's no units because they all begin with a 0. So that doesn't really help us. So then the next step is to look at the next digit. Well, in this case, the next digit is going to be the digit that comes after the decimal point. So in this first decimal, the first digit after the decimal point is 7 tenths. Then we've got 4 tenths, 4 tenths, 0 tenths, 0 tenths. So we can see that the 7 is the largest digit in the tenths place. So if we look at this decimal here, this has got a 7 in the tenths place, so that's going to be my largest decimal. So I have 0.7, I've got 0 units, then my decimal point, then my tenths, and I can see that in the hundredths column, well, there's nothing there. So I could say I have 0 hundredths. So can you see that 0.70 is exactly the same as 0.7? And sometimes this can be very confusing because people look at this and think, oh, this says 70. But remember, it just means 7 tenths and no hundredths, which is exactly the same as just 7 tenths. So I know that 0.7 is my largest decimal, so I'm going to write that down here. So what's the next largest decimal? Well, we need to look at the tenths column again, and I can see that I have a 4 in the tenths column and also a 4 in the tenths column. So I've got to work out which of these is larger. So I have 0.44 and I also have 0.4. Now I'm going to write my place headings in because that's going to help me. So I've got no units, I've got my tenths, and I've got my hundredths column, and I can see that they both have 4 in the tenths column. Now this second decimal here, I can see that there's nothing in the hundredths column, so if I want I can just write a 0 in there to show there are no hundredths, and then it becomes a little bit easier. We can see that we've got 0.40 or 0.44, so I can see that 0.44 is bigger. So I know that 0.44 is my next biggest, so I'm going to write that here, 0.44. So that means that 0.4 must be the next largest, so I'm going to write that here. And then if I want to compare my last two decimals, I've got 0.07 or 0.04. Well, 7 is going to be bigger than 4, isn't it? So I can write down 0.07. That's that decimal, and then that means the smallest decimal in my list is 0.04. So I've gone from my largest decimal over here to my smallest decimal over here. Now let's look at this list of decimals again. It's really useful to remember that when you're working with decimals, you can add zeros onto the end of the decimal, just the end. So if I put a 0 here and a 0 here, so they all look the same because we can see they all have a unit, they all have a decimal point, they all have a tenth, and they all have a hundredth. It's now a lot easier to see which is the biggest. I can see that 70 is the biggest, then I've got 44, then 40, then 07, and then 04. Now it's your turn, so pause the video and then you're going to put these decimals in order from the smallest decimal to the largest decimal. Okay, have a go. Okay, how did you do? Well, remember that you can add zeros onto the ends of the decimals, just the ends, to make them look the same. So let's do that. We can add a 0 here and a 0 here, and then that's going to allow us to organise them from smallest to largest. So I know that my smallest decimal is going to be 0.02, and I can tick that off. My next decimal is going to be 0.11, I'm going to tick that off. Then I have 0.20, going to tick that off. Then I have 0.22, and that means that my largest decimal must be 0.80. Well done. Now try another one. Pause the video and order these decimals from smallest to largest. How did you do? Right, so first thing we're going to do is we can add a 0 onto the ends of our decimals, and then it makes it much easier to compare them. So I can see now that my smallest decimal is going to be 0.14. Then my next smallest is going to be 0.16. Then I can see it's 0.25. Then 0.3 or 0.30, and then 0.8 or 0.80 is my largest. Well done.